G'day, I'm the guy from down under, and as you noticed, I'm not wearing the same attire that I normally do, because we're heading back in time to the year 1914 and the Christmas Truce, as related by C. Dorian Cart, Senior Curator of the National World War I Museum. Imagine being in a cold, wet, muddy trench in a small area of Flanders, Belgium, before Christmas Day of 1914, a summer of war, romantic adventure where heroes defended their homelands and way of life. Was supposed to be over by Christmas. After all, it was just a regional conflict that started in the Balkans. But now it was Christmas, time of peace and goodwill towards others, the celebration of the Prince of Peace. Singing started drifting across the opposing lines of the Western Front that Christmas Eve of 1914. Perhaps imagined a trick, an olive branch. Histories were of little help. The phrase Christmas Truce failed to appear in the indices of almost all of them. Where gunfire allegedly ceased at Christmas 1914, it was dismissed as of little consequence. Yet, when I explored letters, diaries, and memoirs, I found intriguing evidences of its reality. As my wife and I made trips to England on other research projects, we went to the collections of the Imperial War Museum and hunted through the post-Christmas daily press in the British Museum, as it was then, newspaper library in Collingdale. We laboriously went through brittle, yellowing January 1915 newspapers from London to Londonderry. The results were remarkable. On the letter to the editor pages, no censorship was yet in place for a soldier's mail. Some troops wrote graphic letters home. The documented reality left us daily in awe. Recipients often forwarded extraordinary letters to their local newspapers, which printed them without restraint. Soldiers wrote of encountering friendly enemies, ordinary blokes like themselves. Opposing sides were flush with official Christmas boxes, brass ones offered to the English troops, wooden equivalent to the Germans, filled with tobacco, sweets, and snacks. The urge for bartering arose between the warring sides in no man's land, with corpses buried with honor and shell craters filled in, became a place for fraternization rather than for confrontation, for sharing Christmas gifts, singing holiday carols, and bawdy service songs, even for playing football, your soccer, with improvised balls and goals. We found unit records as well as letters and diaries that described friendly kickabouts and even included the scores. The sound of Christmas carols across no man's land encouraged troops from either side to exchange greetings and for some to leave their trenches to meet in no man's land. What would become known as the Christmas Truce was spontaneous and experienced by hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers. Exchanges of English bread for German sausages were made, and German pipes and British cigarettes were lit in Christmas greetings. Wine, beer, schnapps, and issued rum marked the occasion. Some ragged games of football may have taken place. The truce did not occur along the whole of the Western Front, and it was short-lived. Similarly, experiences occurred on the Eastern Front. High Command of either side rallied against it. What actually occurred in the truce is infused with myth, wishful thinking, and some truth. In reading the great numbers of letters and newspaper reports, primarily English, one gets the feeling that the observers desperately wished for an all-encompassing event of peace between the enemies. Private Farden of the Rifle Brigade, writing to his parents in Leighton, says, "We had a very decent Christmas day in the trenches. We had Christmas pudding sent to us, and a few of the boys and myself managed to odd them up. And with some sausage and potatoes and Brussels sprouts, which we succeeded in foraging from a farm, we had a very good dinner. On Christmas Eve, we were surprised to see Christmas trees alight on the tops of the enemy trenches. Some of the Germans, the 139th Saxon Regiment, shouted to our fellows to come over and have a drink and smoke. They turned the searchlight on, and some of our boys went out and met them halfway. The first German who came along threw his arms around one of our chaps' neck and kissed him. Next, they offered us cigars. On Christmas Day, we were out of the trenches along with the Germans, some of whom had song and dance. Why, 2 of our platoons had a game of football. I was surprised to see the German soldiers. Some appeared old, others were boys, and others wore glasses. But they played the game, for they, and some of them, even went as far as to state that they would not shoot as long as our regiment was in that particular set of trenches. A number of our fellows have got addresses from Germans and are going to try and meet one another after the war." Miss N. Thuddy, 1 Peel Street, Bedford, had received a letter from Lance Corporal Cooper of the 2nd Northamptons, which gives an astonishing account of Christmas Day in the trenches. It is dated December 27th. "At last I have found time to answer all your letters. Oh dear, you asked me to let you know what kind of Christmas I had. Well, I never had a merry one because we were in the trenches, but we were quite happy. Now, what I am going to tell you will be hard to believe, but it's quite true. There was no firing on Christmas Day, and the Germans were quite friendly with us. They even came over to our trenches and gave us cigars and cigarettes and chocolate, and of course we gave them things in return. Just after 1 o'clock on Christmas morning, I was on lookout duty, and one of the Germans wished me good morning and a Merry Christmas. I was never more surprised in my life when daylight came to see them all sitting on top of the trenches, waving their hands and singing to us. Just before we came out of the trenches, we came out of them on Christmas night. One of them shouted across, 'Keep your heads down, we are going to fire!' And they sent a dozen bullets flying over the top of our heads. Now, who would believe if they did not see it with their own eyes? It's hard for us to believe. What kind of Christmas did you have? I do hope you enjoyed yourself. I thought of you a good many times. I don't expect it was much of a Christmas in England. I haven't received Mother's parcel yet. I wonder what has become of it. I've had some edibles, but they were nowhere near as good as Mother's." An officer in the Royal Field Artillery writes on December 27th in the Times, "On Christmas Eve, things were very much as usual. We sat around a fire all evening. At about 11 o'clock, a very excited infantry officer came along and told us that all fighting was off, and the men were fraternizing in between the trenches. It had been agreed between the soldiers on both sides that there should be no firing until midnight on Christmas Day. We went back to bed about 12:30 a.m. and stood to arms as usual on Christmas morning. I had a look around, and as nothing seemed to be doing, went along to see some other people. They confirmed that the news of the truce, it was all arranged privately and started by one of our fellows going across. I think he was rather brave to be the first to do it. I arranged to go down to their trenches after breakfast, as they have a place where they're only about 70 to 80 yards apart. Then the colonel and censored came across to see the fun. They arrived about 11 o'clock, and I was on my way back. You can hardly imagine it. The only sentries were two unarmed ones to keep our men from straying out beyond the barbed wire. Our chaps were digging in the open, and they were doing the same. The only forbidden was to make any improvement to the barbed wire. Further, they agreed that if by any mischance a single shot were fired, it would not be taken as an act of war. An apology would be accepted. Also, that firing would be not opened without undue warning on either side. Finally, we all walked out, and one of their officers came to meet us. We all saluted, shook hands, and exchanged cigarettes. Unfortunately, they understood no French or English, and we could not muster a word of German amongst us. You will rather gather that the conversation languished. Finally, they got a man out of the trenches who had lived for some years in America, and he acted as interpreter. The officers were little more than young boys, and one of them had already been wounded. They were intensely polite, and there was any amount of clicking of heels. The soldiers all seemed rather young, but they did not appear very despondent or underfed. One man informed us that they had been told that Russia had been defeated and that the war would be over in 3 weeks. Another asked an officer on our side to send him a photograph to his sister, who lived in Liverpool. I know that is true because the officer showed me the photo. Seems a strange idea to take a stock of one's photos on active service. But there you are. One thing we did notice was that some of them were shy of uniforms. But that may have been merely owing to the fact that they were in the trenches and trying to save their uniforms. The Germans were all for the truce lasting 48 hours, but we stuck out for midnight on Christmas. Sergeant A. Lovell, A Company, the 3rd Rifle Brigade, writing to relatives in Walthamstow on Christmas Day, says, Christmas Day, the most wonderful day on record. In the early hours of the morning, the events of last night appeared as some weird dream. But the day, well, it beggars description. You will hardly credit what I'm going to tell you. Listen, last night, as I sat in my little dugout writing, my chum came bursting upon me with, Bob, look at him. And I listened. From the German trenches came the sound of music and singing. My chum continued, they got Christmas trees all along the top of the trenches. I never saw such a sight. Climbing the parapet, I saw a sight which I shall remember to my dying day. Right along the whole of their line were hung paper lanterns and illuminations of every description, many of them in such positions as to suggest that they were hung on Christmas trees. And as I stood in wonder, a rousing song came over to us, The Watch on the Rhine. Our boys answered with a cheer, while a neighboring regiment sang lustily the national anthem. Some were shooting the lights away, but almost at the first shot there came a shout in really good English, stop shooting. Then began a series of answering shouts from trenches to trench. It was incredible. Hello, hello, you English, we wish to speak. And everyone began to speak all at once. Some were rational, others the reverse to complimentary. Eventually, some sort of order obtained, and a party of our men got out from the trenches and invited the Germans to meet them halfway and talk. And there, in the searchlight, they stood, Englishman and German, chatting and smoking cigarettes together, midway between the lines. A rousing cheer went up from a friend and foe alike. The group was too far away for me to hear what was said, but presently we heard a cheery good night, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to all, with which the parties returned to their respective trenches. After this, we remained the whole night through singing with the enemy, song for song. Give us Tipperary, they cried. whereupon an adjacent Irish regiment let loose a tremendous whoop and complied with the request in a way and only an Irishman can. Were descriptions of football matches and singing carols of peace on earth meant to foster the idea of the Christmas truce they wanted to report to the home folks, so they would not worry as much. If the soldiers from both sides, English, Scot, Saxon, Prussian, Belgian, and French, could come together and shake hands and share food and photographs, could not the world? The following is a copy of a letter received from a Mr. Harry Penfold, Brampton, from a friend in London who received it from an officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps at the front, whose wedding he had attended shortly before the outbreak of the war. This has been a strange Christmas. All has been peaceful except for some occasional sniping on our right, but none on our front. Most extraordinary scenes took place between the trenches. In front of our bit, our men and the Germans got out of their trenches and mixed together, talking and exchanging cigarettes, etc. Some of our people actually went to their trenches and stayed for some time, being entertained by the enemy. The colonel and the adjutant of the 107th Saxon Regiment came out and talked to our people in a very friendly manner. All joined together in a sing-song, each side taking a turn to sing a song, and finally they ended with God Save the King, which the Saxons sang most heartily. This is absolutely true. One of our men was given a bottle of wine in which to drink the king's health. The regiment actually had a football match with the Germans, who beat them 3-2. These people say that they would not shoot our men, but warned against those on their Saxons' left. Some men of one of our regiments opposite them went out of their trenches just as the others had done. But the enemy, now thought to be Prussians, told them to go back and fired on them before they had regained their trenches. The Saxons and our people opposite have arranged a sing-song for tonight and have mutually agreed not to reopen hostilities before midnight. The men in the trenches were singing carols last night. All of the chickens in the countryside have been brought up for their Christmas dinner. And yesterday I saw a machine gun wagon going through laden with barrels of beer. After all, this has been almost a happy, though strange, Christmas. The French diarist Michel Corday wrote in Paris, January 5th, 1915, I have before me a letter from a soldier in which he swears by all that he holds dear that on the 24th of December, 2 regiments in the opposing lines put aside their arms, in defiance of their officers, and fraternized between the trenches. The soldiers exchanged cigars, shook hands, and walked about arm in arm. The Germans promised not to fire that night or the following day, but they kept their word. That seemed to me symbolic. It marks a humane spirit far superior to the war. Despite hate propaganda spewing from headquarters on either side, a fearsome diet of daily casualties from artillery, machine guns, and small arms, and trench life in disgusting filth and sludge, the ordinary soldier had no strong desire to kill or to even maim the enemy, who on the end of the rifle was his unanticipated counterpart, a farmer, factory worker, cabbie, milkman, salesman. Descriptions sent from home of the truce described a world far removed from the gruesome reality of the war. The air filled with jagged artillery shell fragments and shrapnel balls, so thick it seemed that the sky itself was shattered iron. The countless dead were frozen in awkward positions between the lines. The earth itself frozen or so torn apart, or still in furrows from lost arms presented no undisturbed fields for any sort of a match. But if the letters home and newspaper printings of them could present a picture of even the briefest respite, what was more important? Well, I hope you enjoyed that brief view of the Christmas Truce of 1914. I'm that guy from Down Under, and thank you for listening. Good day.